Thank you very much for coming this morning. My title has slightly changed for reasons I'll explain on the next slide, and I hope that won't disappoint anybody. Plan of the talk is that first I'm going to give some very brief points about a recent theory of consciousness called MetaDyn that I've been developing, and it's very distinctive in being based on something that I call meta-causation, although other people in the causation area have called it higher order causation. I will be explaining what that is in a minute. Then I'm very briefly going to give some mixed messages about, from MetaDyn, what MetaDyn says about the possibility of machine consciousness. There's a negative aspect and a positive aspect. But then actually the main part of the talk is going to be some very initial thoughts, very much work in progress, on benefits that I claim this theory promises as regards how consciousness and cognitive processes in general, which could otherwise have been unconscious, and especially affective processes, emotional, pain, pleasure, things like that, how they can all meld together in a graceful way according to this theory, be it in machine consciousness or in natural consciousness. Now, this melding aspect of the talk is actually strand one in my abstract, and I mentioned another strand called Mimicry, which is about simulating conscious systems in the computer. I'm not going to be saying very much at all about that, so I apologize if anybody came just for that. So what is meta-causation? I'm going to give very sort of intuitive idea on this slide, just to orient you towards the concept, give you a rough idea about what it's about. You can see it arising in quite ordinary English sentences. If you say something like, John made Sally cry, and this caused her mother to be angry, one possible interpretation, and there are others, but one interpretation of this is to take the word this to refer to John making Sally cry. In other words, the causation of Sally's crying by John. It's that causation that caused Sally's mother to become angry. So John's causing Sally to cry caused her mother to be angry. But because the cause there is itself a causing, I put in green in the middle that middle causing in the diagram, in the sentence, is a meta-causing, because its cause side is itself a matter of causation. Okay? And as I say, other people have called this higher order causation. Now, this particular sort of meta-causation, I call it left-handed because the brown causing there is to the left of the green causing. Next example is John forced Mary to make Bill go away. This is a case of right-handed meta-causation. So something that John did meta-caused the causing of Bill to go away by Sally. So it's something John did set up the actual causing that happened there. Okay? And then finally, you can imagine meta-causation where both the cause side and the effect side involve causation. And so you could say it's ambidextrous. It's both left-handed and right-handed. And actually that case is particularly important for my MetaDyn theory. And I do want to emphasize also that the causings, the brown ones, that can be on the left and right sides, can themselves be matters of meta-causation. So this can sort of recursively build up upon itself to any degree. Okay. Now this just gives a very intuitive idea of the notion of meta-causing. It doesn't prove that meta-causation actually exists in the world. It could just be a way we talk about things or think about things. Okay, but I'm now going to give a motivation, not a proof, but a motivation for thinking that consciousness involves meta-causation in some very deep way. Okay? And this is not yet the theory as such, that will come a little bit later. The first step is an observation which I'm mainly going to have to leave as something that I hope is fairly intuitively plausible to you. There are thought experiments that could support this, and I've included some in my papers, but I won't be able to go through those today. The point I'm trying to make on this slide is that the consciousness of a system can't be down to simply the trajectory of states that the system goes through. It must be something to do with the way those states causally hang together, the way they develop causally from each other. And one thing you can think about here is if you imagine that a particular computer running a particular program was conscious, and then you think about the states of memory at time 1, states of memory at time 2, and so on, surely it can't be just that sequence of memory states that constitutes the consciousness of this running system. Surely it must be the way those states develop from each other causally. Now, if we can perhaps talk about this more in the Q&A part, if you're not convinced by that. So for now, I'm going to just leave it as a plausible, I hope plausible working hypothesis that in any conscious process, the causal connections amongst the states of the process must be crucial for that process being conscious, if it is indeed conscious. Now, that just says the causation, the internal causation within the process matters. It matters for consciousness. But why and in what way does it matter? Now, a key point here is that I think of consciousness as something that exists objectively in the world. It's not a matter of somebody's construal. It's not a matter of theorists construing certain things to be conscious or not. They really are conscious or not. So if consciousness intrinsically involves causation, that's a crucial element of consciousness, then surely the causation itself must matter in some objective way. Again, that mattering of the causation cannot be a matter of construal by some theorist. It's an objective fact about the world. Now, you could say here, okay, philosophers are fond of using the word brute. There's just a brute fact about the world that if you've got a certain type of causation within a process, then you've got consciousness. But I'd actually like to go further than that and try to tease out why the causation within a process would matter. And the answer I came up with, I'm not saying it's the only possible answer, is that the causation within a conscious process matters explicitly to that process itself. The process itself is not only driven along in the ordinary way by its internal causation, as a train might be, it also, in a sense, in a non-conceptual sense, notices its own causation. It takes account explicitly of its own causation. Now, one sort of a taking account you might immediately think of here is to say, and especially if you're an AI person, as I used to be, is to say that the process represents its own causation. There's no difficulty in principle about the idea of each state of a process representing the causation within that very process. You could write an AI program to do that. But I would say under current notions of what representation is, that would not be adequate, but I haven't got time to go into the reasons why I'm saying that. So my alternative to having the process represent its own causation is to say, well, okay, how do things matter to other things in the physical world? They matter through causing things to happen. Okay, so I want to say that the causation within a conscious process matters because it actually causes something in that process. It matters to the process by having a causal effect on that very process. So the causation within a conscious process is an entity in its own right, physical entity in its own right, that is the cause of effects within that very process. But that causing must be meta-causation, because its cause side is the causation within the process. So that is my motivation for thinking consciousness involves causation. And then on the basis of that, I developed this theory that I call MetaDyn. The Dyn stands for dynamism, by the way, which is, I actually prefer that word to causation. But never mind, I'm sticking with causation here. It's based upon that above motivation. And I should first say here that I'm not thinking of causation now at the sort of human level of children making other children cry and mothers getting angry and all that type of thing. I think of causation as a sort of continuous flux in the world at a very basic physical level, fundamental physical level. So it's a fundamental physical thing in the world. that actually is atypical. If you look at most theories of causation, they're not like that. But there are some accounts of causation in areas like the power theory. Neo-Aristotelian power theory has a notion of causation that's a bit like the one I'm talking about here. Secondly, I want to emphasize that MetaDyn is highly multiply realizable type of theory, in that it doesn't care about what type of matter or field, electromagnetic field or anything that this causation appears in. It simply doesn't matter. What matters is the patterns of meta-causation. Okay, so the physical medium, the nature of that is irrelevant here. And what the theory says in what may look like horrible detail here, but I'll try to explain it. It's meant to be fairly simple. If you imagine a conscious process, there's some time t, or any arbitrary time t in the process depicted in red. Across that time, you've got meta-causation going from before that time to that time and beyond. And that's depicted here by that thick green arrow in the middle. And that has on its cause side, that meta-causing has on its cause side all the causation in some interval of time up to but not including time t. So both the ordinary causation and the meta-causation within that interval is the cause of, in a meta-causal event, so to speak, that has an effect on state at time t, but also on the causings, be they ordinary ones or meta ones again, on the right side of that time. So you've got ambidextrous meta-causation going across time t from before to afterwards, and that is this theory's particular version of the idea that a conscious process is noticing its own causation. It's continuously noticing some of the causation up to the present moment, and that has an effect on how the process then proceeds. Okay, a causal effect on how it proceeds. Now, I'd like actually to abstract now away from the temporal aspect of the march of time through the process, and just to think of it more holistically. I'd like to think of this conscious process as a sort of whirl of what I call internally reflexive meta-causation. And I've actually borrowed the term whirl here from Galen Strawson, but my whirl is a different sort of whirl from his. And it's an arrangement of meta-causation that meta-causally affects itself. And where that meta-causal auto-affecting, so the whole, if you think of the whole meta-causation in the world as sort of one thing holistically, it's meta-causally affecting itself. But that meta-causal auto-affecting is itself part of that same arrangement. Okay, so it's a highly reflexive sort of picture here. And I do suppose that there is some ordinary causation mixed up in this as well. It's not just meta-causation, but it's the whirl of meta-causation, which is actually what is responsible for consciousness. And indeed, I say that an episode of consciousness is identical to such a whirl. Okay, it's not just based on it or arises from it or something like that. It's actually type identical to it. I should say that you can have causal inputs and outputs into and out of this whirl, and they can be either ordinary causation or meta-causation. One thing I want to say, there's been a lot of talk of things like pure awareness in this conference, and I quite like that idea of pure awareness. And I would say that the less ordinary causation there is in this world, the more it's just a world of meta-causation, and the less input and output there is, the purer the consciousness is. The more contentless it is. Now, I'd like to just mention a concept of flavoring that I have, and I'm going to use this concept later, but just for now, I want to introduce it very simply on the basis of perception. If you imagine an organism, a conscious organism, so it has a whirl of meta-causation in it. It's looking at a red rose, let's say, through some sort of eye, be it a natural eye or a mechanical, electronic eye or whatever. There's some path of ordinary causation, probably, that leads from the rose ultimately into the whirl. It has some effect on the whirl, which I'm not going to talk about in detail. It could be quite a holistic effect on the whirl. It needn't be a detailed effect in just one part of it. It could be a holistic effect, And I like to say that input is flavoring the whirl. So it's in some perhaps quite subtle way changing the way the causation, and in particular the whirl of meta-causation going on in there. So I like to say that as a result of perception of this rose, the consciousness becomes rose flavored, or more exactly, rose image input flavored. Okay, so you get flavored consciousness. Okay, fine. Okay. Now, some straightforward consequences of this approach is firstly in red, on the assumption that I think it's fairly safe that an ordinary present-day computer or even quantum computer doesn't involve the sort of meta-causation I'm talking about in appreciable quantities. There may be a little bit there, and in particular, it probably, I would guess, does not involve the sort of whirl of meta-causation that you need for consciousness, just in ordinary computer circuitry. If that's the case, then it doesn't matter what program you're running on it. It doesn't matter how algorithmically sophisticated it is, or what sort of cognitive processing and reasoning or whatever it might be doing, or it could even be simulating some conscious animal, for example. It might be a numerical simulation of a conscious animal. Simply doesn't matter what the program is. That physical system consisting of the running computer cannot be conscious, according to this theory. But that doesn't mean the theory is against machine consciousness or artificial consciousness more generally. You could have, at least in principle, a synthetic copy of the brain, be it in biological or non-biological material. And if that copy captured enough of the meta-causation within the brain that's being simulated, then you would automatically have another consciousness. Okay, so, and that would be an artificial consciousness. But more broadly than that, I'm not against the, or MetaDyn isn't against the idea that you could have some future computer whose circuitry, whatever nature, physical nature that has, does involve the sort of meta-causation I've talked about, and thereby the running of a program on that computer would be a conscious process. Okay, so MetaDyn certainly allows for this possibility, although I don't have any detailed account of how that would happen. But now I want to go on to what it would take, to meld consciousness and cognition together. So I think of cognitive processes as being something that, in principle, could go on unconsciously in many cases, at least. You don't need consciousness to do reasoning, for example. And so I want to say, and this is just to orient you a bit, I want to say a little bit about unconscious cognitive processing. There's a fair amount of evidence that you can find in the literature that there are quite complex cognitive processes that can proceed unconsciously in humans. So people often talk about when you're driving, sometimes you might have done some complicated maneuvers, but you're chatting to your passenger and you have no consciousness of having done those maneuvers. Okay, so that sort of evidence is adduced. But also I think it's a fairly common observation that in creative acts or in problem solving or even in finding bugs in a computer program, it's a common observation. It's actually when you turn your conscious attention away from the problem, that's when you have the real insights. That's when you solve the problem. So complex cognitive processing must be going on underneath. So I want to say that even in a conscious machine, there might be all sorts of complex, unconscious cognitive processing going on as well. Those such processes proceed presumably just through ordinary causation in a familiar way that happens in current AI systems. But in principle, I'm saying, we can now imagine that such a sequence of steps that would otherwise have been unconscious cognitive processing can be enriched by having meta-causation of the right sort, all mixed up within it, melded with it in such a way that the processing becomes conscious. So if you imagine an unconscious cognitive process, it's got various streams of ordinary causation doing complicated things, but then a conscious cognitive process has this green meta-causation mixed in, and you can see there that I'm trying to depict the idea that the meta-causation is picking up on the blue causal steps that might be reasoning steps, for example, or steps in forming an analogy or something like that. And those meta-causations can have effects on other steps in the reasoning or whatever it is. They can have, that meta-causation can affect other meta-causal links, and it can feed off meta-causal links. So the idea here is that the green meta-causation is in this whirly form that is needed for consciousness, so that gives you the consciousness. but it's intimately and inextricably bound up with the progress of the reasoning as such, and it's or whatever the cognitive processing is, and it's in that way that that processing is now conscious processing, but it's not just an exact copy of processing you could otherwise have done unconsciously. The fact that you've got the meta-causation in there is changing the course of the reasoning, okay? So I will unfortunately have to skip affect and just go on to, it's going to do the conclusion slide, okay? According to MetaDyn, consciousness has nothing intrinsically to do with computation or complex cognitive processing, no matter how sophisticated. But MetaDyn would allow a suitable meta-causal machine to have conscious cognition. I've only just actually started to try to work on how you get complicated conscious cognitive processing in this theory. But I believe the approach promises some benefits. So I believe that you can much more smoothly integrate cognition and consciousness in this theory in a very intricate, intimate way that really accounts for how the cognition becomes conscious when it would otherwise not be conscious. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Is the next speaker in the room? Yes, okay. Maybe you can get your slides running. Yes, question.
So, did you say, are you suggesting that these meta-cognitive worlds, are they necessary or are they sufficient for consciousness?
Very good question. My argumentation that I started off, that motivation, only leads to a necessary.